Thank you for joining us for the final presentation in a three-part series on the South Asheville Cemetery, the oldest public cemetery for African American burials in Asheville. I'm Chesky Smith, the Executive Director of the Western North Carolina Historical Association in Asheville. In Part 1, we looked at the origins of the cemetery as a burial ground for people who died while enslaved by the Smith and or McDowell families of Asheville, and compared the burial locations of James M. Smith, the patriarch of the Smith family, who at the height of his wealth held at least 70 people captive, and Tilda, a wife and mother who was enslaved by James M. Smith. And we also discussed some of the reasons that we see dramatic differences in James and Tilda's burial grounds today. We also learned about the life of George Avery, who emancipated himself from his enslavers, the McDowells, to join the Union Army and eventually become the longtime caretaker of the South Asheville Cemetery. In Part 2, we looked at one family, the Baileys, who were enslaved first by James M. Smith and then by his daughter, Sarah Lucinda Smith, and her husband, William Wallace McDowell. The members of the Bailey family that we looked at, James, Rebecca, and Charlotte, all survived to gain their freedom. And while Charlotte moved away from Western North Carolina, James and likely Rebecca were laid to rest in the South Asheville Cemetery. We also discussed the relative sparsity of written documentation regarding the lives of enslaved people and the importance of making the primary documents that do exist as accessible as possible. In this final presentation, we'll consider how the individual and collective stories of the people laid to rest in the South Asheville Cemetery can tell us a larger story of Asheville that begins in the early days of non-native settlement in the area. The founding of the South Asheville Cemetery begins with its first burial. To determine when the first burial occurred in the cemetery, we have to actually go back to the beginnings of non-native settlement in the area. Like all of Asheville, the 2-acre parcel of land on which the South Asheville Cemetery is located now was originally Cherokee land and the land of their ancestors. From oral tradition, we believe that the first non-native settlers in the Asheville area were white families who brought enslaved African Americans with them into the Blue Ridge Mountains in the 1780s. Varying newspaper reports dating back to the 1980s theorize potential dates for when the first burial occurred in the South Asheville Cemetery. These reports include the following phrases: the cemetery could have been in use since the 1790s, graves date at least as far back as 1834, and according to oral tradition, there is a tombstone in the cemetery that dates back to 1854 and is the only tombstone in North Carolina of someone who died while enslaved. Unfortunately, the sources of these bits of information are unsighted, and we haven't yet been able to verify any of these dates. Here's what we do know. The land that encompasses the South Asheville Cemetery likely came into non-native possession by way of a land grant from the state of North Carolina. After the creation of North Carolina as a state in 1776, one of the first duties of the General Assembly was to pass an act in November 1777 that allowed men who swore their allegiance to the state to purchase 640 acres of quote-unquote vacant land for 50 shillings an acre and begin then colonizing the area. We know from land deeds that Daniel Smith, who waged war against Native people throughout his life, purchased 308 acres from William Stewart in 1796 for 100 pounds, which was part of Stewart's 640 acres land grant purchase from the state. This 308-acre tract appears to have covered much of what is now the AB Tech campus to the north and to the east of the confluence of the Swannanoa and the French Broad rivers, but it doesn't appear to quite reach the land that is now the final resting place of the 2,000 or more people who are buried in the South Asheville Cemetery. We are pretty confident, however, that Daniel Smith was likely the first person who would have designated the land that is now the South Asheville Cemetery as a burial ground for enslaved people. Daniel Smith was born in New Jersey. He fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, and around 1785 he settled with his wife, Mary Davidson Smith, in a log cabin near what is present-day Aston Park in Asheville. In 1787, they had a son who is thought to have been the first non-native child born in western North Carolina. His name was James M. Smith. According to census data, the Smith family did not enslave anyone in 1790, but by 1796, when James was nearly 10 years old, his father sold an unnamed woman to William Davidson, who was likely Daniel's father-in-law, along with horses, cattle, hogs, sheep, furniture, and farming utensils. In 1800, the Smith family enslaved one person. In 1810, they had 9 living children, and the Smiths now enslaved 2 people, who may be the same 2 boys, Cain, who was 16, and Ned, who was 9, who Smith purchased in 1801 for 505 Spanish milled dollars, which was a common currency in early America, made of 1 ounce of solid silver with curved sides that would prevent people from shaving off the edges, and it was more commonly known as a piece of 8. By 1920, Daniel Smith enslaved 9 people. His son James, who had since married and begun having children of his own, enslaved another 9 people, and in 1822, James purchased 2 more people, a woman named Nancy and a 2-year-old named Dick. Daniel Smith died in 1824, and at the time he held at least 10 people captive, including Tom, Suki, Robeson, Anderson, Matilda, Alex, Live, Campbell, Harrison, and Zelpha. In his will, he ordered that they stay with his wife, but that their value be split between 5 of his children. It appears that James then purchased his siblings' shares and likely became their sole enslaver. Then, in 1827, James bought a 12-year-old girl named Lucy. So, by 1830, James enslaved around 39 people, and by 1840, he enslaved 70 people. His success as a merchant in Asheville was directly related to the number of people he enslaved. The more people he enslaved, the more money he made. The more money he made, the more people he could enslave, and so on and so forth. This was also the case for most of Asheville's wealthy land and business owners at the time, and it's a key theme in looking at Asheville's early growth. It's difficult to imagine that between the 1790s, when Daniel Smith began enslaving people, and 1840, when James Smith enslaved at least 70 people, that the people they enslaved had not yet experienced a death among their number, which would have led to the establishment of a burial ground designated specifically for those who died while enslaved. Currently, however, the earliest written record we have of a death of an enslaved person is between 1850 and 1854, when James M. Smith amended his will to indicate that a woman named Tilda and a man named Bob had passed away. Tilda, who we talked about in more depth in part 1 of this series, had been married to a wagoner named Joe, and the couple had at least 5 children. It seems likely then that Tilda's family would have ensured that their wife and mother had a proper burial. If Tilda and Bob are buried in South Asheville, and they likely are, their locations are unknown. However, the graves in the cemetery are all oriented east to west so that the deceased face the rising sun, which potentially began with the cemetery's first burial and is certainly part of burial traditions. Also, we know from later deeds that the cemetery only covered about 1/4 of an acre until at least 1890, so we can likely narrow the locations of these early graves to the initial 1/4 acre portion of the cemetery. When James Smith died in 1856, he willed the land that contained the cemetery to his daughter, Sarah Lucinda Smith, and her husband, William Wallace McDowell. They are the parcels you can see in the plat here. It appears that the South Asheville Cemetery is at the top right-hand corner of the plat, just off what is labeled the Old Road. The McDowells continued to use this small portion as a burial ground for the people that they enslaved. One point of interest, after James Smith's death in 1856, his accounts were settled by his son-in-law. He owed $201.30 to his doctor for medical care over the last year and a half. And while much of the treatment is for medicines and house calls for himself and his family, the doctor charged $3 for coming out to the house in the rain on the day that Smith died. Some of the costs are actually for the treatment of the people that James enslaved, especially for sick children who are not named here. But on April 14th, 1856, the doctor did visit the house at night to attend to a woman named Mary at a charge of $1.50. He visited Mary again on the 25th and the 26th. It certainly would have been in Smith's financial interest to keep the people he enslaved healthy. It seems likely then that this first phase of burials in the cemetery, that is, the burials of people who were enslaved when they passed away, was likely fairly low, at least relative to the 2,000 plus people who are now laid to rest there. While James M. Smith and his children enslaved over 100 people in Asheville between 1800 and 1865, it appears that most of them likely lived to see the end of slavery in the United States. Burials continued in the cemetery after 1865, when the cemetery became open to the public. Though most burials were associated with the congregants of two local churches, St. John A. Baptist and what was known at the time as the South Asheville AME Zion Methodist Church, and the surrounding community, it was certainly not limited to them. Any African American person could be buried in the South Asheville Cemetery. The family of the deceased would pay the gravedigger, who was likely George Avery, and then the gravedigger would also collect a fee of $1 that would be given to the McDowell family, who still owned the land at the time. The first written documentation of the cemetery occurs in 1890, when the McDowells sold the quarter-acre tract to the trustees of the AME Zion Methodist Church for $10. Many of the church's members had previously been enslaved by the McDowells, like the family we discussed in part 2 of the series, the Baileys, as well as George Avery and Ben Ragsdale, who were trustees of the church. It is also likely that many of the early members of the South Asheville community had previously been enslaved by the Smith and or McDowell families. Around the same time that the McDowell family transferred the cemetery, they also began selling, or at least formalizing the sale of, residential lands around the cemetery to the same men who are listed as trustees of the AME Church, like George Avery, Ben Ragsdale, and Lazarus Clayton. It's possible that the bonds of friendship and family in the early South Asheville community may have developed prior to emancipation. And even after the transfer of the cemetery to the South Asheville community, it appears that Sarah McDowell continued to collect burial fees. This is likely because as the original quarter-acre plot filled up, burials then continued outside of its boundaries onto McDowell land, eventually filling the 2 acres that it does today. After the turn of the 20th century, we can begin to rely less on official government records and learn more about the cemetery from the recollections of people who lived in the community and had friends and family buried there, thanks in part to a 1989 oral history project that is archived at UNC Asheville. The information that follows is from those interviewed during the project unless otherwise noted. After Sarah McDowell's death in 1905, a cemetery board was created by the Baptist and AME Zion churches to collect burial fees from those who were not members of the churches. Fees ranged from $75 to $85, with an additional $15 paid directly to the gravedigger. Some families would actually dig the graves themselves in order to save money. It's possible that the McDowell family continued to employ the gravedigger and collect fees until the cemetery closed. South Asheville Cemetery was less expensive than other cemeteries for African Americans at the time, which charged at least $115 for a burial. Most families did carry burial insurance to ensure that they could properly bury their family members. People who could not afford a burial were generally buried in the Potter's Field at Riverside Cemetery, which, though it was open to both black and white people, maintained segregated burial plots. There is also some evidence that if a family could not afford a grave, that the McDowell family would grant them a free grave in the South Asheville Cemetery. Coffins in the cemetery were generally made of pine, but a few were made of more expensive metal. George Gibson remembered in a 1985 interview that was published in the Asheville Citizen-Times, quote, "When people were poor, they were buried in baskets. Others had simple wooden boxes." After the funeral, the grave was marked by the funeral home with a tin marker that could later be replaced by a gravestone if the family could afford one. The family was also responsible for dressing the body, and many people would save their best clothing to be buried in. People were also often buried wearing their best jewelry and/or their wedding ring. Burials in the cemetery appear to have increased dramatically after 1915. According to Linda Brown's research, there are 2,215 death certificates which list South Asheville as the burial location between 1915 and 1943. Many of the graves date to the 1918 flu epidemic, when sometimes 4 to 5 graves were dug every day. According to Richard Houston, who helped his foster father George Avery dig graves during the flu epidemic, quote, "They were sick today and dead tomorrow. People were dying like flies." The cemetery closed to burials in 1939. There are conflicting reports as to why. South Asheville and the cemetery were annexed into the city of Asheville in the late 1920s. George Avery died in 1938, and then the cemetery was actually condemned by the city of Asheville in 1939, and part of it was taken over by eminent domain. When they did this, the city said that the cemetery was at capacity and cited an ordinance against burials within the city limits. But perhaps these reasons were merely excuses. Many South Asheville residents felt the move to prevent further burials in the cemetery occurred because the city and the neighboring Kenilworth community wanted to expand development around and potentially into the cemetery. There were, however, still a few burials after the cemetery closed. To our knowledge, Robert C. Watkins was the last person buried there in 1943. Watkins was a cook in the Navy who was killed while serving his country during the Second World War. He was only 33 years old. It seems that he was able to be buried there because he had a family plot in the cemetery. This appears to also be true for others who were laid to rest at South Asheville after it closed. Despite the closing of the cemetery and the annexation of the neighborhood into city limits, the South Asheville community continued to thrive and had homes, businesses, churches, groceries, small stores, a beer garden, home businesses, a school, and an Oddfellows Lodge, all within its boundaries. After the cemetery closed, upkeep became a community effort. The ministers at the AME and Baptist churches would announce the date of a cleanup during the service, and often the entire congregation would come out to help. Women would generally prepare food and drink, and men would do the physical labor of maintaining the cemetery. Families would also come out throughout the year to clean and decorate the plots of their ancestors. But slowly, as people moved away and elders died out, the locations of the graves and their occupants were forgotten, especially without new burials coming into the family plots. But at one time, many decorations could be found throughout the cemetery. One particular custom was to place a favorite or treasured object on a gravesite, a vase for flowers, or a child's favorite toy. Sadly, the cemetery was not immune to vandalism. One South Asheville resident on their way to visit their sister's grave recalled seeing a white woman on horseback carrying a vase that looked familiar. When they arrived at their sister's grave, they found that the family heirloom vase that they had placed there was gone. And unfortunately, this was not the worst of the grave desecration that occurred after the cemetery was closed to new burials. In 1956, city police investigated an open grave in the cemetery that had been reported by a neighboring property owner. The box that held the casket was exposed and the headstone had been overturned. Police investigated to see if the casket had been opened or removed, but no further report was made. The headstone to the grave was reported in the Asheville Citizen as belonging to Robert C. Walker, presumably a misprint for Robert C. Watkins. Then, on Halloween 1958, local teenagers, approximately, quote, 30 white youths, buried a teenage boy in a sunken grave in the cemetery. An article in the Asheville Citizen that was published 2 weeks after the incident read, quote, "At the cemetery, the boys had undermined a sunken grave, excavating a shallow space beneath a concrete slab to permit room for their victim, who was pushed headfirst into the opening. A heavy tombstone taken from the grave was lowered over the aperture, leaving the boy sealed in the musty chamber. He was in there for several hours while the boys sat around nearby, eating and listening to calls for help. The police chief told the boys at the time that they could be charged with trespassing or kidnapping if they did it again. Their excuse? We thought it was fun." But presumably the newspaper piece created enough public outcry to force the police chief's hand, and within 2 days of the article being published, 6 boys were arrested on charges of assault and damaging graves. Ultimately, 3 of the boys were sentenced. They had to each pay a $10 fine for injuring graves. The police chief said that, quote, "His office had conferred with the city health department relative to the condition of the graves in the cemetery and was told that steps will be taken to improve the site." Whether there was any follow-up is unclear. The cemetery came back into the public eye in the early 1980s as many of Asheville's urban renewal projects were coming to a close, when a developer became interested in building a condominium complex near the cemetery. Both the Kenilworth and South Asheville neighborhoods lobbied against the complex, some organizers even using the potential encroachment on the cemetery as a talking point. But the city greenlit the project and several graves were exhumed and moved, according to Augusta Young, who was one of the founders of the South Asheville Cemetery Association. The condos were never built, and several years later, investors in the project sued the developer for fraud, conspiracy, and breach of contract. But the controversy surrounding the condos did create some positive change. The threat to the cemetery and the potential for future similar threats became the impetus for the founding of the South Asheville Cemetery Association, which was incorporated in 1981 to protect, maintain, and document the cemetery. At the same time, the city of Asheville and the McDowell family heirs deeded the remaining portions of the cemetery to the association. In 2004, Asheville's Historic Resources Commission recognized the cemetery as a local historic landmark, and the association is now on track to have the area designated as a National Historic Site. To find out more about the South Asheville Cemetery, to donate or volunteer, visit southashevillecemetery.net. And to learn more about the Western North Carolina Historical Association and our current efforts to uncover fuller histories of the people who were enslaved on the grounds of our facility, which is now known as the Smith McDowell House, visit wnchistory.org.